Move along, sweetheart. Sidewalk's not a lounge, that's how it started. A lazy insult tossed like a gum wrapper. Then the glint of trauma shears catching the last of the sun at maple and juniper. Then the soft thud of my first curl hitting concrete, while a grown man in uniform smiled like he'd finally cleaned a stain off his city. I wish I could tell you I shouted or swung or delivered the kind of line that wins arguments for the rest of your life. But the truth is, I stared at a chip in the brick behind me and counted my heartbeats while Officer Riker hummed an off-key summer song and told me to hold still. And if you've ever been on the wrong end of someone else's story, you know how fast your body learns the difference between fear and clarity, you know what I mean? It was a beautiful evening in Riverton. Long light and easy air. Families heading to the coffee shop and the florist arranging mums in buckets, me in a simple dress and flats with peaches in my tote and a paperback tucked under. Not a scene that should have made news. Not a scene that should have become the moment a precinct forgot who it worked for. And yet here we are, because a man with a badge decided my hair was a health concern and my presence was a problem he could fix with metal and laughter. He stepped close like the sidewalk belonged to him. Like my space was a suggestion, asked for ID without a hello. Barely glanced at my address in Westbridge before flicking my license back like a card he didn't want. Told me Westbridge was for families and this block was for cleaning. And when the rookie behind him said softly that I was just waiting for the light, Riker said I got it, Ty, and reached for those shears as if the word sanitation could turn an assault into a public service. And no, there wasn't a no loitering sign, there was just me and a crosswalk and a man who'd decided humiliation was a teaching tool. He pinned me gently but firmly the way people do when they want the camera to see posture, not force that calculated weight that says I'm not hurting you while your shoulder burns against brick, and he said this is for your own good. While another officer wandered over with a smirk and a phone and said, "Dude, for the gram." And the rookie went pale and the scissors began to bite, snip and snip and snip curls I'd grown with patience, tumbling to the dust while someone else's laughter tried to take up residence inside my chest. But I didn't give them a sound, I gave them silence. And the thing about silence is it makes room for names and times and details to line up like soldiers. When he finished, he brushed the blades on his pants like I'd stained him, told me to take my clown wig and go, and I bent down and picked up one curl, because you are allowed to take with you what they tried to throw away. Then I looked him in the eye and said, "Thank you, you've been very clear." And I walked the few steps it took for the world to change, because the inside of that precinct was buzzing with fluorescent lights and the kind of confidence that comes from telling the same lie 100 times and getting away with it 99. They parked me on a cold bench. No one read me my rights. No one said what I was being charged with. They used the word biohazard in a sentence about my hair and called it de-escalation, in a way that would have been funny if it hadn't been so practiced. And while they talked, I listened, because if you've ever taught policy, you know the rules aren't just words on paper, they're habits, they're shortcuts, they're the places where a system shows you what it loves most. I watched the rookie's hands shake a little as he filled out the blotter, heard the sergeant grumble that dispatch was lighting him up about phones and a haircut at Maple, and Juniper felt the scrape on my shoulder settling into a sting. I would document later, and when they led me to booking, I kept my voice steady and said I'll comply. But for the record, I haven't washed my hands since arrest, and any residue is part of the incident. Please log my clothing as evidence, not trash. And the tech blinked like he'd never heard the word evidence from someone wearing lip gloss, and asked without thinking, "What do you do?" And I said, "I teach policy, and I write a little," and that was the closest I came to bragging all night. They handed me a phone for my one call, and I dialed a number I keep memorized, not because I expect to need it, but because I live in a world where sometimes you do. And when it picked up, I didn't say hello. I said, "Hail Naomi, downtown. Precinct, initiate, Silver 3, lockdown, preserve, body cam, and radio for the last 4 hours. IA runs through, you bring a big bag." Then I hung up and thanked the tech, because manners are free even when the room is not. And the ripples started almost immediately, a quiet tightening in the building like the bricks themselves remembered their job. A level alert rolled across a monitor dispatch, rerouted no one in or out without authorization. The sergeant started walking faster, like he suddenly needed to be in 2 places at once. He stopped at my cell and asked who I called, and I smiled and said a friend. And he didn't buy it, but he didn't press, because he could feel it too. That shift you get when the right eyes turn toward the right door. 10 minutes later, those doors opened and the noise dropped out of the air like someone had cut a wire. 2 command staff came through first without touching the desk. Wide shoulders, hard eyes, and then the man who owns the quiet. My husband, Sheriff Ramon Hale, who does not shout by trade and has never needed to. and he took 2 steps into the room and looked at the sergeant and said, "Where is my wife?" And if you want to know what the twist feels like, it feels like that, a sentence that lands so clean, the building understands it before the people do. Heads turned like a tide. Riker blinked like a man coming out of a dream. He laughed because he thought that was still possible, asked your wife, like he'd misheard the universe. And the sergeant pointed toward Holding and said, "She's in B." And Ramon didn't look at Riker. He didn't look at anyone. He walked to the cells, took off his jacket and put it over my shoulders, brought me back. Beside him, scanned the room until he found the person who had tried to make me small and said, "Officer Riker, stand up. Internal Affairs, take him into custody. Collect his duty weapon, phone, and body cam. Every officer at Maple and Juniper surrenders devices. Now anyone who was there is on administrative leave. And if you're wondering whether I felt vindicated in that second, I felt protected and I felt tired and I felt like a knot I'd held my whole life loosened half an inch." Riker tried to grab the frayed end of his lie and twist it back into a rope, asked on what charge, like he still had the ground under his feet. And Ramon said, "Assault with a dangerous instrument, deprivation of rights under color of law, official misconduct. We'll let the tapes handle the rest." And Riker turned to the rookie. "The way a drowning man turns to driftwood," said Ty. "Tell him she was combative, tell him." I de-escalated, and Ty finally looked up and chose the person he wanted to be for the rest of his career. Said she never fought you. She never even raised her voice, and you could feel the room breathe a different kind of air. That night turned into coffee and files and fluorescent hum and the kind of reading that makes you want to stand up and walk the length of a hallway just to remember how your legs work. Because the jacket Internal Affairs pulled on Riker wasn't a garment. It was a map of harm complaint after complaint, names that did not belong in a stack. They belonged in a circle of chairs, language that rhymed with itself so often you could set it to a beat, argumentative, resistant, agitated, and dispositions that might as well have been copy-paste, unsubstantiated, unfounded, referred to training. And I could have told you the pattern before we began, but patterns aren't real to certain people until the numbers touch their desk. We made decisions that looked boring on paper and turned out to be the point. Evidence preservation locked down, like a vault devices surrendered immediately. Every manager who signed off on one of those boilerplate dispositions flagged for review. Every prior complainant contacted by a team that knew how to speak like humans. And then we scheduled a hearing that wasn't tucked into a windowless office but held at the county civic hall where the microphones work and the lights don't flicker because transparency is a set of choices, not a slogan on a podium. 2 weeks later, I walked into that hall wearing a red dress because sometimes color is armor, and sometimes it is a promise. I didn't hide my head. A good stylist had turned what was left into a short crown that felt like it belonged to me. And when they called me to the table, I didn't bring a speech. I brought questions, because I've learned the fastest way to unspool a lie is to hand it its own thread. "Officer Riker, I said in your report you described my hairstyle as a health hazard and framed your action as sanitation. Please cite the exact policy that authorizes cutting a civilian's hair on site as a safety measure." And his lawyer objected, and the chair overruled, and the silence that followed did more work than any monologue I could have delivered. Then I asked about the use of force continuum we teach in week 1 at the academy, and invited him to explain how metal shears on an unarmed person's head count as de-escalation over disengagement. And he said, "Training judgment call," and could not locate a page or a module or a name. And if that sounds dry to you, trust me, in that room, you could have heard the click of a pen at the back row. The board cued the body cam and played the part. Everyone had to see the line on the sidewalk, the way I said I was crossing the rookie soft protest, the snip, 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 the laughter that sounded different once you knew what it cost. And I did not watch the screen. I watched the room watch the screen. The families of people whose names were once gray boxes on a spreadsheet wiping their eyes without shame. Reporters who had practiced neutral faces swallowing hard officers who had never seen their job from this angle shifting in their seats. And when the video stopped, no one clapped because justice is not a show. It is a record being set straight in a register that was bent for too long. The board read the findings: sustained and sustained and sustained, pattern and violation and dishonor, badge stripped, recommendation for decertification to the state, referral to the district attorney, and if you're waiting for the gavel. Yes, it fell a clean, hard rap that sounded like a door finally fitting its frame. And the satisfaction wasn't fireworks. It was a deep exhale you didn't realize you'd been holding since you were 12 and learned how fast a situation can turn when someone else gets to narrate it first. The part that mattered even more came after the slow, careful building of rules that would have made that night harder to pull off and easier to call out what the county calls the Hale protocols. And I call a checklist with teeth automatic routing of use of force videos to a civilian cloud. The department can't edit an early warning system that flags officers before the pattern becomes a headline, an oversight board with subpoena power and a budget that lifts it out of bake sale territory, training that looks like round tables and role play and hard questions taught by people who have worn the badge and people who have worn the harm. And yes, the rookie Ty showed up for the first session, sat in the back, and then raised his hand and told the truth into a mic that squealed because the sound guy is human. And he said silence is heavy when you're new, and that procedures can make the right thing less lonely. And I wrote that down because I plan to say it to every class until they don't need me anymore. Riker took a plea the men who laughed are no longer wearing shields. The sergeant who let it roll on autopilot is not a sergeant, and that does not fix what happened on the sidewalk, but it marks a map for the next person who thinks cutting a woman's hair in public is a way to send a message. And if you think I'm talking about hair, you're hearing the wrong frequency. I'm talking about dignity, I'm talking about control, I'm talking about someone deciding that your body is their classroom and you will pay the tuition. 6 months after Maple and Juniper, I stood at that same corner and watched a dad hold his kid's hand while the kid pressed the crosswalk button. Even though it already had the walk sign, the florist had switched out sunflowers for mums, and the bar finally spelled trivia. Right. I caught my reflection in the glass and saw a face I recognized, tired and stubborn, and a little amused at how life keeps messing with our plans, hair short and sure. And I thought about how everything could have gone if I had shouted, or if I had begged, or if I had done the thing a worse story needed me to do, and I remembered what I tell my recruits. Now you don't